Hey everyone, welcome to the Mobility Studio Open Call Info session. My name is Drayton Taylor and I'm the lead for the Mobility Studio here in Michigan. Just to give an overview of what to expect today in this discussion, we have New Lab Program Director Kate Shubik with us today to give an overview of New Lab, and I'll give some more specifics on the Mobility Studio itself, and then we will be concluding with a Q&A session to answer some of the questions you may have. Even though the Q&A is at the end, please feel free to drop questions in the chat as we go so our team can capture them. And I will turn it over to Kate.
Awesome, thanks Drayton. Hi everybody. So some of you may be familiar with New Lab already, but for anyone who's not, New Lab is a private company that's based in Brooklyn, New York, and we're made up of a community of experts and innovators, all on a mission to apply transformative tech to help solve major challenges facing the world. So we leverage technologies across a range of domains, things like robotics, AI, and computer vision, with the mission of transforming things that matter most. And when we say that, we mean things like health, our cities, our infrastructure. And our business has two primary components that we leverage in order to reach this goal. The first is our membership community. So this is made up of over 800 entrepreneurs, engineers, and inventors that have access to our space and a suite of resources to help their companies scale. The second major component is our studio programs. And so these are New Lab's innovation programs in which we work with partners, which can be a Fortune 500 company or a government entity or a social impact investor, with the goal of bringing together our community and startups from across the world with industry and civic leaders to help co-design and test sustainable and scalable solutions. So in a few minutes, Drayton's going to provide more information about the Mobility Studio, which is a great example of kind of what our studio model looks like in practice. So moving on to the next slide here, you'll see a few stats that give you a better sense of our community. So New Lab's membership includes more than 160 companies, which represent a collective value of $2.6 billion and have raised north of $700 million in funding. Our members have access to 110,000 square feet of space across 2 different locations, and this includes prototyping labs, collaborative workspaces, private offices for our members, conference rooms, and also several event spaces. And we also have a full-time product realization team and over $5 million of on-site equipment to help our community members take a concept from just an initial idea to a full working prototype. Some of what this includes is one-on-one consultations with that team to support the product development process, training, consultations, and kind of full service fabrication. And of course, access to a suite of different labs, including 3D printing, CNC, wood and metal shops, textiles, electronic benches, kind of runs the gamut of what our companies may need from a prototyping standpoint. And then as you can see in these first 2 images here, New Lab has 2 physical locations in Brooklyn, New York. So our headquarters is housed in an 84,000 square foot building that's a former shipbuilding facility in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And the Navy Yard is this 300-acre industrial campus that kind of operates like a mini city and functions as a living lab, which is great for our member companies to be able to test out products and technologies in their own backyard in a real world environment. And then just a short walk away from our headquarters, we have an additional location, and this has more workspace and conference rooms to accommodate some of our growing companies who are adding more and more folks to their teams. And then lastly, we're very excited to be expanding our physical footprint to Detroit in the near future. And as we kind of solidify those plans, we are currently set up in our beta space in the Corktown neighborhood of Detroit. And here, so New Lab's really proud to be home to a dynamic community of members at New Lab. We have 70% of our founders with a master's degree or doctorate, 39% of our members are serial entrepreneurs, and 38% have actually relocated to our headquarters from outside of New York. So really attracting talent globally. And these characteristics are all contributing to creating an ecosystem at New Lab that's very representative of a diverse set of perspectives and thinking, and really brings a unique lens to the work that we do here. So I wanted to dive a bit more into kind of our networked community. We've really created some interactive tools for our members. So in addition to some of the physical resources that I mentioned earlier, our members have access to a suite of networking opportunities and exclusive programming. This can be from subject matters relevant to their work, whether it's vetted experts in legal or communications, business development, finance, human resources, essentially any type of topics that are really resourceful for a new company that's looking to scale and grow. Strategic introductions from the New Lab team or others in our network. So that can be advisors or investors, even potential customers or partners for our community. We have an OS system that enables members to connect with other members in the community. It's a very active way for our members to chat with each other and kind of have casual conversation. And an OS system that allows our members to be able to kind of easily see resources that are at their hands and kind of access discounts and other things that we make available to our members. And then lastly, New Lab partners with a variety of different entities. You can see from this slide here, everything from Fortune 500 companies to business improvement districts and even foundations. And again, the kind of common thread between all of these stakeholders is these groups wanting to really understand how they can tap into New Lab's ecosystem and how emerging technology can play a role in solving their business challenges or kind of moving the needle on their civic or social goals. Which is a nice segue into our partnership with Ford and Michigan Central and the Mobility Studio, which I'll pass it back to Drayton to share more about now.
Thanks, Kate. So now that everyone knows what New Lab is, let's dive into the Mobility Studio, which is focused on shaping that electrified, connected, and autonomous future. The Mobility Studio is a collaboration between Ford, Michigan Central, and New Lab, which will support startups and entrepreneurs as they build, pilot, and scale frontier technologies to advance that future of mobility. The first focus area where the studio is tackling this year is EV charging in the urban context, specifically from the commercial fleet perspective. The reason this is important is because over the next 10 to 20 years, commercial fleets are expected to adopt nearly 15 million electric vehicles in the US alone. So commercial fleets present a transformational opportunity for teams across disciplines to design and launch pilots that make it technically feasible and commercially viable for fleets to electrify and support a sustainable energy future. So these are the focus areas the studio is recruiting startups to address during this cohort. The first being multi-use charging hubs, which create an opportunity to share and consolidate charging infrastructure resources across multiple commercial fleets to maximize utility and share infrastructure costs. So we are looking for solutions that enable this dynamic test bed of plug and play EV, micromobility, and battery charging solutions to be easily integrated and piloted. The next focus area that we have is supporting drivers who take their vehicles home. And the reason this is important is because a lot of fleet owners will have drivers that use their work vehicles as personal vehicles as well. So how do we enable these drivers to be able to charge and easily maintain these new electric vehicles from residents that may not be currently equipped to do so, including multi-unit dwellings and apartment buildings? Connected fleet management, unlocking that the power of shared data to streamline fleet operations with charging needs and battery ranges, and use that data to predict when and where charging should be available. EV to X, this is an opportunity to reduce the maintenance costs for an electrified fleet by enabling bidirectional charging and V2G grid management, energy management systems. Platforms for EVs as energy resilient systems, and V2V charging platforms. And then last but not least, second life battery applications. So once a battery can no longer satisfy the requirements for use in EVs anymore, with capacity and performance dropping, how might we enable supply chain solutions to apply second life EV batteries to solve other industry problems? So looking at what participation in the studio brings to the startups, the studio has a non-dilutive grant pool of $200,000 to offset some of the costs associated with companies piloting, which will be equally dispersed amongst the 5 to 10 teams selected to participate in the studio. Teams will also have exposure to our network of investors, corporate partners, and programs. Next, the studio presents a unique opportunity for companies to apply their technologies to pressing electrification challenges and validate them in the industry through pilots. Studio participants will also have access to New Lab's community of over 160 startups that are already scaling transformative technology. to prototyping space and industry experts as well. So looking at this slide, this is a high-level snapshot of the Mobility Studio timeline. Our open call launched on April 28th and will remain open until June 2nd. And remember, applications will be reviewed on a rolling basis. So the earlier you submit, the more access you will have to ask questions, as well as for us to reach out and set up potentially one-on-one calls to deep dive any parts of your application. Also note, to best help with the planning of pilot resource access, it would be helpful to have applicants be upfront on what kinds of resources and support you need to be successful during that phase. So during the review process in June, applications will be assessed by New Lab and Ford, and also by industry experts as well. So we will also be reaching out to teams if we have any questions, which again might include those one-on-one calls to deep dive any parts of your application we might have questions on, or to understand your pilot proposals a little bit more. And we will notify teams probably in about early July as to the status of your application, if you're accepted or not to be a part of this year's cohort. Piloting will happen on a rolling basis starting in July and will continue through September. Before pilots launch, though, we will work with teams to set up individualized pilot programs, plans, and work with selected industry experts if there are needs for permits or any resources. The studio will culminate in a demo day happening in October, and we will work with Ford and studio partners to explore pathways for partnership and potential follow-on engagement after the conclusion of the studio. So now we'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. Feel free to drop questions in the chat if there's anything you'd like to discuss specifically.
Great, and I'm going to come back on here and share some of the questions that we have coming in for Drayton to answer. So I think one that's coming up, Drayton, that would be good to address is who is eligible to apply? So if we could speak a bit more about that, and specifically a little bit around what stage of startups are being targeted for this year's cohort for our studios in general.
Absolutely. So the Mobility Studio is open to startup companies globally. Companies from outside the US are eligible to apply as long as they are committed to dedicating the personnel to be part of the studio, including overseeing pilot deployment and being available for key milestones. So including that development, deployment, and operations of the pilot, and that studio demo day in October. To be eligible to participate, applicants must own or at least have the legal right to use the rights to any intellectual property related to technologies, products, solutions, or otherwise included in their applications.
Awesome, thanks, Drayton. Another question we have coming in is about where startups have to be located. So maybe talk a little bit about any location requirements, and I think it'd be good to segue into talking about where any requirements around pilot location as well.
Sure. So that's something that we at New Lab will be able to work with studio participants to identify those. Sorry, is the question for where they will be piloting, or if they're able to apply from other locations?
It's both. So just talking a bit about how we view location for the studio and the pilots.
Sure. So we'll work with those teams to identify potential pilot locations based on their individual project needs by leveraging our own infrastructure at New Lab, as well as with Ford and Michigan Central and other studio partner infrastructure. Given the short development pilot period and the current state, given the short development period for pilots and the current state of deployed commercial EVs in the US, we anticipate some pilots may take place virtually or as simulations. So something like building a predictive model or creating a virtual environment to test fleet management software. It's all about proving that business model, testing technological hypotheses. So we're open to working in different locations, or having pilots deployed in different locations based on individual pilot needs.
Great, thank you. Another question here is, can I submit an application for more than one focus area?
Absolutely. Yeah, the application does allow you to check off more than one focus area if you feel your proposed solution meets the needs of more than one area. Absolutely.
Great. And another question here is, what is the specific role of Ford in this program? So Drayton, maybe you can talk a little bit about how we've been collaborating with Ford to date and what that engagement will look like going forward.
Mhm. Absolutely. So New Lab has worked closely with Ford leadership since the launch of the Mobility Studio in 2020. The focus areas you see in the open call reflect topic areas that they are excited to explore with external partners. New Lab will support selected teams to interact with key Ford personnel throughout the studio, including in that design, deployment, and evaluation of teams' pilot projects. So specifically, you can expect input from our team, but also Team Edison, which is the team leading Ford's electrification strategy and development.
Great. Let's see. Another question coming in here is if you could talk a bit more about the length of the Mobility Studio.
Absolutely. So like mentioned on the timeline screen, the studio did kick off its open call on April 28th. Um, sorry. Um, and we will remain, or we will keep that open call open until June 2nd. And then we will have a few months for the pilot preparation, pilot execution, and review and feedback stage. So it'll go from, we'll accept startups at the beginning of July, and then conclude with a demo day in October.
Okay, great. Switching over a bit to look at chat as well, because I know we have a few coming in there. So I think we've got a couple questions about kind of the stage of startups being targeted for this year's cohort and kind of who qualifies as a startup. So I'm happy to maybe chime in on that a bit, but I think typically we don't have any, hard and fast kind of caps on money raised, but we're really looking at that kind of seed to Series A type startup that, has a product in hand, but is really seeing value in this pilot opportunity to be able to test or validate their technology or their service kind of in this real world environment and with, Ford at the table in the context of the focus areas that we discussed. So that's what we mean when we say startup, but certainly if you have any more specific questions or want to make sure that your specific company is eligible, you're always welcome to reach out with any more specific questions around that requirement. And then let me see, let's back over. So what are, Drayton, here's another good one. Can you talk a bit about some of the physical and digital resources that will be available as part of the studio participation?
Absolutely, great question. So depending on individual team needs, and again, coming back to the application process, it's best to be as descriptive as possible about what resources you would need to execute your vision of a pilot. But we will work with Ford and additional studio partners to ensure that sufficient resources are available to enable pilot success. And those resources might include, data, whether it's fleet or vehicle battery data, as well as access to potential fleet managers and drivers to be able to do some of that empathy work, get feedback on your pilot. So hardware, software data, and then of course interview access as well.
Thanks, Drayton. Another question here is if you can talk a bit more about what happens at the end of the studio.
Great question. Yeah, we like to work with startups and we don't want this to be a one-off engagement. So we're going to work with Ford and studio partners to explore pathways for partnership and that potential follow-on engagement. And we're going to capture learnings from all the startup pilots and participating teams to fuel possible future collaborations through New Lab itself as well.
Great. Let's see. And then maybe one more here that I think could be interesting to elaborate on is a question around kind of the scope or range or what we mean when we say pilot for purposes of the Mobility Studio. And so Drayton, I think it might be helpful to maybe give an example and kind of talk through some of the different pilot concepts that we've thought about for these different focus areas, just to give folks a bit more color on what we would think of as a pilot.
Absolutely. So when we think of pilots, it's all about proving the technical feasibility and the commercial viability of a new business vertical. So if we were considering second life battery applications, In the next 5 to 10 years, we anticipate that there will be a large number of EV batteries that are no longer able to meet the demand of an electric vehicle. So what are we to do with these batteries? And what is makes the most sense for fleet managers for Ford to do? So could we take those batteries and put them into a storage unit, which will help create energy resistance or resiliency? So in the event of a blackout, can you still provide energy to a microgrid, to a building, to a home? Additionally, taking those batteries and being able to create bidirectional flow to and from the grid. Can we prove a business model that will actually make it more economically viable to own an electrified fleet, because you can offset peak demand charges when you're charging vehicles? Can you buy energy when it's at a lower price point and then be able to sell back to the grid when there's more demand in that area? So being able to prove to Ford, being able to prove that a business vertical makes sense to pursue, and that the technology is in the right stage to be able to go after it.
Great, thanks so much, Drayton. That's helpful. I think I'm seeing one more question here that I'm happy to take. It's around Ford providing documentation for connected car APIs, and I think what we'll say on that front is that we recognize that kind of each pilot and each application will have different needs and requirements in order to be successful and kind of test what you're putting forward. And so, as Drayton had mentioned, it'd be really great to start to understand what type of resources across the board, whether it's from Ford or from the studio, or kind of leveraging infrastructure that you feel you would need for your pilot to be successful. And part of our process in that review is understanding that suite of resources and then making the right kind of connections and putting those pieces in place in order to ensure that if your pilot were to move forward, that it would be successful. So we'll kind of be assessing those as they come in and then pulling together the right set of resources. So just a reminder to kind of be highlighting that in your application so we have access to that information and can work on that as we move forward. And then I think that's all the questions I see currently, but maybe we'll just give it another couple seconds if folks have any other questions they'd like to type in. But as a reminder, you've got the mobility email address up here, so definitely feel free to reach out if you have a very specific question about your company or your application, or if anything sort of just comes to mind after you've been thinking about the information provided here. Always kind of between our team here, happy to continue the conversation with anyone.
Absolutely, and just to add to that, if you do come up with questions after today as well, feel free to reach out. Always happy to hop on a call and discuss any aspects of the studio that you want to deep dive a little bit further, or if you have any questions as you go through that application process.
Yes. And I see a question that just came in about consortium bids being submitted. Would definitely love to hear offline a bit more about your thoughts around that type of consortium model for submitting an application. I would say that generally we'll have one kind of company or team be sort of the lead and submit an application. I think there are opportunities where maybe you're working very closely, if you're a hardware company with a software company, and to put forth kind of a stronger application. And those things can be kind of reviewed on a case-by-case basis. But I think it would be best if you have something specific in mind. We'd love to kind of chat through that and understand what you're thinking, so then we can best guide you on how to submit an application. Great. So I think that's it. Oh, another one just come in. So recognizing that there is 200K budget, how many companies do you anticipate accepting, and how much do you anticipate per company? Should we be putting in a budget proposal in the application? Do you want to start with that one, Drayton?
Sure. So typically, New Lab Studios will accept a cohort of 5 to 10 with that initial budget or money allocation of 200K being divvied up evenly between each of those companies. So if we accept 5 companies, obviously there'll be a larger pot for each of the startups to be able to use and put into executing their pilots. If we accept more companies, then it'll be a slightly lower amount.
Yeah, and in terms of a budget proposal in your application, I don't think you need to submit a formal budget proposal, but I would keep in mind that pool that we have and the fact that that'll be spread between 5 to 10 teams to give you a ballpark idea of the grant funding that'll be allocated if you're selected. And so certainly your pilot, you should be able to kind of run that pilot with that help of that grant funding. So if you're putting forth something that's, of course, very, very expensive or 200K or something like that, keep in mind the scale of the pilot that you're putting forward, given kind of your own knowledge of your company and this grant funding and kind of how that'll impact what you're able to deliver.
Yeah, if you're concerned about the cost of a pilot, we're happy to hop on a call offline to help understand the scale and the scope of what you're thinking.
Yeah, and I see another kind of follow-on question that just came in about whether New Lab covers the total project cost or part of the project cost with match funding from the applicant. So the amount of funding that's provided is, again, that 200K is the grant funding that's divided amongst the teams. So this shouldn't be thought of as kind of an investment or revenue coming in. This is really kind of grant funding that's meant to offset the cost of the project. So again, depending on the scale of what you're putting forth, maybe it covers it, maybe it covers part of it. Again, to Drayton's point, that's something to keep in mind as you're thinking about the scale of your pilot and what you would like to propose. And if you're getting into kind of specifics or want feedback about how to potentially scale something down, if that's the situation you're in, or what would be an appropriate scale to propose, we're happy to have that conversation about your specific application.
Yeah, and that's where it's helpful to really be descriptive of what resources you think will be needed to execute your pilot, and letting us know, if you what you don't have. That way we can check with Ford and check with our partners to understand what we're actually able to bring to the table to meet those needs.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody. I think that concludes our session, but Drayton, I'll let you close it out before we
No, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you everyone for taking the time to participate today. We hope this was informative, and we look forward to reviewing our applications.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Take care.